On today's World Insight, the WTO Ministerial Conference yielded small wins in vaccine waivers and fisheries. Has the WTO made a case for globalization and global cooperation? Our exclusive with WTO Deputy Director-General Zhang Xiangchen.
It's an incredible achievement. It's a hard win.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference, otherwise known as MC12, wrapped up last week. The agreement reached by MC12 is to have quite some impact for many parts of the world from now on. They cover COVID-19 vaccines, overfishing, e-commerce, and food security. At a time when the world faces the Russian-Ukraine conflict and a pandemic that has taken millions of lives, WTO Director-General Nzogi Okonjo-Iweala urged countries to accept the unprecedented package of the trade agreement. Under the package, ministers gave their support to trade rules banning unnecessary restrictions on food exports and drew up rules to ensure COVID-19 vaccine availability. They also made crucial progress in the 20-year effort to regulate fisheries subsidies. Many believe that the WTO this time has demonstrated its credibility, which is based on multilateralism and consensus building. On the achievements of MC12 and its significance, I spoke to Zhang Xiangchen, WTO Deputy Director-General, not long after the agreement made known to the world. One can possibly even feel today the excitement in the air. Ambassador Zhang, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for taking your time out of an extremely busy schedule. I could almost imagine the days that you are involved with over the past week about the negotiation. Now, some suggest earlier this could be a break or make it a moment for WTO. This time, though, there are quite some results. Tell me more about your analysis of the significance of this deal after the MC12.
I think more people believe the outcome of MC12 is an incredible achievement. It's a hard-won achievement, especially after the almost 5 years negotiation since Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference. And all the subjects in the outcome document are quite relevant to the global challenges people are facing: the food prices, the vaccine shortage, and also the environment challenge.
Now, Ambassador Zhang, there have been a lot of talks about the geopolitics, the danger of decoupling, the changes of global supply chains, and the crisis that we are facing right now, many of them. Now, how did you think this meeting managed to nail it, even though not 100%, but quite an extent?
Actually, since 2018, the financial crisis, the WTO has been hit heavily by different kinds of crises: the financial crisis, the trade tension between China and US on the trade issues, and the pandemic. And now you mentioned the crisis between Ukraine and Russia. So before the meeting, we had a concern how to manage this meeting. But now we feel a little bit relaxed. During the MC12, members mainly focus on the substance of the issue, the trade-related issues. There's a limited impact of this crisis in Europe now.
I really wonder, how did you and your colleagues at WTO headquarters trying to, set the foundation for negotiators so that everybody could focus on the result rather than other things that might distract the final results?
As you know, the WTO is an organization we call is member-driven organization. So it's subject to the members to focus on the what they want to do in the negotiations. And I think that just because of the crisis in Europe, members have more sense of urgency to reach some agreement on the issues I just mentioned. I can give you an example. The prototype of the TRIPS waiver agreement just emerged immediately after the crisis of Ukraine.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, we talk about all these achievements. One of those, of course, is, as you mentioned, the partial waiver of intellectual property on the COVID-19 related vaccines and also other medical tools. Tell us more about what do you think is the extent that this could help?
I think the objective assessment of this TRIPS waiver agreement is that it's something, but not everything. Because developing countries, LDCs, if they need the manufacture of vaccines, they need not only the patent, but also the skilled workers, the infrastructures, and the know-how, business security. But patent is one of those important elements. So I think the agreement on TRIPS waivers of the patent is a big improvement to help those developing countries to expand their capacity of manufacturing. We couldn't forget now the pandemic is going on. Although in some countries, people can be vaccinated 2 doses, 3 doses, but in Africa, only 30 people are vaccinated. So there's still a huge imbalance of the distribution of vaccines. So those poor countries, the vulnerable countries, they can only rely on their own manufacturing capability. So this TRIPS waiver to somehow can help them to achieve this capability.
Now, there are so many different things that if we think about both the manufacturing, the transporting, and the implementation of these vaccines, the inoculation, and the list goes on. So to what extent is this deal going to help? What kinds of countries will this deal help?
I think the Africa will be the major beneficiary of this TRIPS waiver agreement.
What do you mean by that?
In some African countries, like South Africa, like Egypt, they have some capability of manufacturing. If the most vulnerable country, LDCs in Africa, if they have any infrastructure, the manufacturing capability, even they have this waiver, even they have the license, they couldn't produce the vaccine. It's easy to understand, but for those countries I just mentioned, they may benefit from these TRIPS waivers. Having said that, I would like to mention that TRIPS waiver is a kind of exception to the protection of intellectual property, right? And the function of WTO is to encourage innovation through implementing the IT protection. So we have to strike a balance between, the flexibility the vulnerable country need, and also, the holders of the patent, the producer of the vaccines, mainly in the developed countries. I don't want to argue who is right, who is wrong, but to strike a balance to keep encouraging the innovation at the same time to give the flexibility to the poor countries.
This balance is extremely challenging. In fact, during the time of MC12, I organized through our programs some discussions among different interest groups, and certainly there are very different views. So tell me, when you were in the room witnessing that negotiation taking place, what were some of the most important stumbling blocks and how were they overcome?
We experienced in the past one member can block the whole process. Even 163 members agree, but one country can block. So that's the reason why in the past few years, it's very difficult for the WTO to reach consensus, a multilateral agreement. This time, we organized a different format of negotiations, the bilateral, small group, and semestic discussion, plenaries. It's an inclusive and transparent process. Although some members who are not invited in the small group may have some complaint, but you can imagine it's not possible for you to organize 164 members to conduct a negotiation. So to guarantee this process is inclusive and transparency is important. At the same time, we need different configurations of the negotiation.
So now in retrospect, Mr. Ambassador, when you were working together with the Director General of the WTO on this, preparing for this during the process of negotiation, what do you think are the key words that you guys keep on emphasizing on so that eventually we see really the success?
I think the key word is compromise. If you want to reach agreement, of course you can defend your interest. It's legitimate for you to do that. But the other members also have their interest. It's also legitimate for them to defend their interest. If all the members want to reach agreement, they need to find a balance of their interest, to show flexibility, to compromise here and there. With this spirit, the WTO can move forward.
But you know, Mr. Ambassador, what role do you think on the TRIPS and the waiver of IPR thing for the COVID-19 related medical tools? How much role does developing country, emerging economies play in this regard to make it a success?
In the WTO, the developing countries and the IDCs are playing more and more important roles. On one hand, they are the major beneficiary if we can reach agreement on TRIPS waivers. At the same time, they have the systemic concerns about the balance of right obligation in these organizations. TRIPS agreement has been reached 20 years ago. At that time, the role of the developing countries is different from that we have in MC12. So the developing countries, on one hand, they have more economic power. At the same time, they are more experienced, more better equipped in the negotiations.
That is one thing, the waiver of intellectual property of COVID-19 related medical tools. The other thing is fisheries. Now, we know how difficult it is because over the past several MCs, ministerial meetings, no result. Why this time? Why eventually?
The WTO has conducted the fishery subsidy negotiation for more than 20 years. There's no result. It's mainly because the different interests of the members. We have the major subsidizers. Of course, they are reluctant to cut or to reduce or eliminate all the subsidies. And we have the members have no subsidies, but they may have the plan or intention to give support to their fishery industry in the future. And we also have the poor countries. They have no big fishery industry, but they have artisanal, the smaller fishery. So how to reach a balance among the different countries with different interests? That's the challenge we are facing. And there's a joke in Geneva, if we continue the fishery negotiation in the next 20 years, we don't need to negotiate about the fishery subsidy because no fish in the ocean.
Oh.
So this is unfortunate. So that the objective of negotiation is to protect the ocean, to protect the environment. It's about the sustainable development. I think in the MC12, members reached the consensus that we need to reach agreement to do the part of WTO to contribute to the sustainable development from our perspective. And the fishery subsidy agreement is a partial one, which addressed the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishery subsidies. But the more critical issues like overfish, overcapacity remains unresolved. The negotiation will continue after MC12.
Are we thinking about the next ministerial conference or even before that?
According to the agreement, for the agreement on the IUU, there's a stipulation within 4 years, if there's no further agreement on the fishery overfish and overcapacity, the agreement will stop. So hopefully we can reach agreement by MC 13 or even earlier.
Mr. Ambassador, there are always skepticism, as you may know, especially today when the world is so divided, apparently. Interest groups are so eager to express their opinions. So how do you read these kind of skepticism, even though this is quite a success of WTO at this time with the agreement among all members, Mr. Ambassador?
I think you're absolutely right that there is skepticism before the MC12. If you look at the headline of the media, no one believes WTO can reach agreement on any issue. 2 months ago, they make an announcement of failure of WTO. 2 months ago, before the MC12, someone made an announcement. But finally, we reached something, some important agreement. What behind this successful story? I witnessed, the professional negotiations among different members, especially for the major players. We all know there's the trade tension between China and the United States, but I witnessed the delegation of China and delegation of the United States. They sit down together to negotiate on the issue, which are important for both of them, and they reach consensus. And this kind of professionalism in the multilateral trading system is very helpful. The mutual trust can only be accumulated through those detailed negotiations. We can accumulate the small wins for the big ones.
That's a rare thing, isn't it? Chinese and the American delegation sitting together face to face, not in harsh words, but trying to be constructive and trying to be supportive of a global agreement.
Yes, because both China and the United States are major trading countries, they have common interest. There's a convergence of interest for China and for the United States. For example, on the e-commerce moratorium, I think China and US, they have common interest. On fishery subsidy, both China and the United States are major subsidizers. And for the TRIPS waivers, both China and the United States are the participants of the negotiations. So, of course, there are different views, different interests, but if they can sit down, as you mentioned, face to face and conduct a negotiation in a professional manner, they can find a solution.
Everybody knows that these days, multilateral negotiations almost means nothing in result. And yet this time, WTO has managed to showcase it is still possible, even on some of the issues that experienced decades of deadlock. Now, Mr. Ambassador, is this going to be an exception this time? Or do you think that trade globally and people's discussions about trade has become such a pillar of communications in our world that it goes beyond politics, it goes beyond geopolitics, goes beyond diplomacy?
I don't think we reach agreement in MC12 by accident. The rationale behind the success on MC12 is that the globalization is going on. Although in different countries have different views on globalization, there's an imbalance of the interest allocation during this globalization in developed countries, in developing ones. However, all countries are facing global challenges like climate change, like digital transformation. So only the multilateral system, including the WTO, can tackle those global challenges. No single country, no bilateral mechanism, no regional organization can deal with those challenges. So that's the reason why WTO still have hope if the members have the good will to sit down together to talk to each other. We still have can find a way to find convergence among all the WTO members.
WTO was almost one of the very first places when you see the cracks of spirit when it comes to support for multilateralism. This time, it's different. It is one that is bringing fresh air. So this, to me, is a very interesting sequence, Mr. Ambassador. You're a seasoned diplomat. I mean, you're a seasoned negotiator, and now you serve as the DDG for World Trade Organization. Tell me more about your personal experiences of history in retrospect, including this time.
I'm a believer of multilateral criticism. Although I witnessed that the challenge the multilateral trading system is facing and the competition between the multilateralism and the regionalism. There's also the merit for regionalism, for the regional economic trade cooperation. They have their advantage, but as I mentioned just now, those regional cooperation mechanisms cannot replace the role of multilateral trading. Multilateral trading system is merit which cannot be replaced by others. Of course, to reach agreement among 164 members is more difficult than to reach agreement among dozens of members in the region. Having said that, I don't want to overstate the success of MC12. There's still a fundamental problem, the systemic issues. The WTO dispute settlement system has not been resumed in the MC12. The fundamental difference remains on the issues like agriculture, domestic support, market access, so on and so forth. So after MC12, there's a very difficult journey for the WTO. But as I mentioned, we can only accumulate the small wins for the big wins. If we keep this momentum, I'm still confident about the future of the multilateral.
Mr. Ambassador, though there are a lot of debate about, if our international system is a rule-based international system, then whose rule is it? Who are going to obey the rules? Who are going to design the rules? What is the process of designing the rules? And WTO, every day you are dealing with these issues in a bigger or smaller scale. So what are your answers to these questions?
Yes, WTO is a rule-based system. All the rules were negotiated 70 years ago or 25 years ago. So the rule book of WTO is subject to improvement and updated. So the WTO needs a reform. Although on WTO reform, different members have different view. There's no consensus yet in the WTO about the objective, principles, structures, content of the WTO reform. But there is a consensus among members that necessary WTO reform is needed, which is stipulated in the Ministerial Declaration. And the members agree the process to conduct dialogue, discussion, negotiation on WTO reform after MC12. I think it's a good outcome we can achieve in MC12. After MC12, we can start the dialogue on WTO reform. And many issues can be discussed on this framework. And the objective of the discussion of WTO reform is to make some deliverables to M313.
As the DDG for the Deputy Director General for the WTO, what is your hope for big trading nations like China and the United States?
I hope the big players can continue their spirit of professionalism, which they demonstrate in MC12, to continue this candid dialogue on those controversial issues between them. At the same time, I do want to emphasize that the problem of the big players in WTO is not the only issue of the WTO. You know, the majority of WTO members are developing countries and the LDCs. They are the vulnerable ones, and although they are members of the WTO, I don't think they have been fully integrated into the global trading system. So when we focus on the major issue among the major players, we couldn't forget, you know, those members. We need to help them to narrow the gap of the asymmetry of information, the gap of knowledge, the digital gap, so on and so forth, to encourage them to catch up with the trend of the development of globalization. And actually, this is my responsibility as the DDD responsible for the development-related issues.
Mr. Ambassador, as you may know, when we talk about developing and emerging economies, the BRICS summit is to begin soon. So there are also going to be gatherings of business leaders from the BRICS economies. Tell me more about how is this deal reached at MC12 likely to pave the way for constructive discussions among these emerging and developing countries?
I think the BRIC countries, they are all emerging economies, playing an important role in the global economies, and also they are playing a very important role in the WTO, in the MC12. All the BRICS countries joined the consensus in the outcome document of MC12. I think the relationship between the regional cooperation, including BRICS and the multilateral trading system WTO, is dynamic. The relationship can be complementary. The achievement of WTO can encourage the BRICS countries to make further improvement of their regional cooperation. For example, e-commerce. There's a mechanism among the BRICS countries. And I think the moratorium on e-commerce reached in the MC12, which can lay a basic foundation for the regional cooperation among BRICS countries. And in the WTO, we also reached agreement on the response to the pandemic and response to the food prices. And I think there's also the discussion among the BRICS countries in this regard. So as I mentioned that we hope the outcome of BRICS summit can make a complementary contribution to the global challenges we are all facing.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for sharing your precious time out of extremely busy schedule, and congratulations to the agreement reached with MC12. Please extend our appreciation to also your colleagues at WTO. Thank you. That's my exclusive interview with Zhang Xiangchen, Deputy Director General of World Trade Organization, on the just concluded MC12 and the hard-to-come agreement reached by the conference. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us.